Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this absolutely spectacular summer evening. I think it is the third or second longest day of the year, so I know a lot of you probably are going to go outside when we're done, but thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to host this. We have about 30% of our audience who have never been to a Cary event before, so I will very briefly talk about Kerry Institute. We're based in Millbrook, New York, about 100 miles north of New York City. We are an independent research institute, by which I mean we are not part of any other university or institution. We're about 100 staff on our campus, and we work all over the world and all over the country on issues related to large-scale ecological studies or ecosystem science. We tend to specialize in the freshwater, forests, urban ecology and disease ecology. And the freshwater ecology program has had a major emphasis on the Hudson River for the last 35 years. So it's really a wonderful opportunity to have Stuart Findlay giving a conversation or having a conversation with me for the Ned Ames lecture. So for those of you who don't know who Ned Ames is a very well-kept secret. For those of you in conservation in New York State and beyond, you probably know Ned as somebody who helped found many things, including Kerry Institute, the Hudson River Foundation, where he served as the chair for many decades, NRDC, PIPSI, the Pacific and Palisades Commission. I should know better because I was at lunch with Ned on Monday, but Ned really is a remarkable conservationist and has been a trustee of Cary for many years. And as I said, helped found Kerry Institute with Gene Likens when he was running the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust. Anyway, so Ned, this is for you. We know you love the Hudson, and Stuart and I are really happy to be talking about the future of science on the Hudson River. So most of you are interested public, but about a third of you are scientists. And I'm going to scroll down and see, not surprisingly, well, no, maybe a little surprisingly, almost 15%, 16% of you are bird watchers or nature watchers, but a lot of people get out on the Hudson to enjoy the water. And so a lot of what we'll talk about is the water and the ecology of that water. So it's my pleasure to be having this conversation with Stuart Findlay. Stuart is a ecologist emeritus at Kerry Institute, by which we mean he retired very recently. I had to drag him out of retirement for this seminar or for this conversation, but didn't have to drag very hard. Stuart is, like many Cary scientists, the major difference between being an emeritus scientist and being a full-time scientist is when you are driving into the Institute to go to the library or go to work or talk to friends. If you want to take a left and go to the Hudson River and just go out for the day on the Hudson, you have no guilt in doing so. But Stuart, why don't you join us? I hope your camera's working and we can dive into this discussion. Good evening.
Good evening, Josh, and everyone else. Good to be here.
And thank you for making it. You know, Stuart, we have, I think one of the things I was going to say, but when I don't look at my notes, I always forget one thing. Tonight, when we talk about this work, there were many people at Kerry Institute and many other people up and down the Hudson River who were deeply engaged with both the conceptual ideas behind the work we've done on the Hudson, but collecting data, working on implementing those data for management. Stuart, sir, you served for several decades now on the Hudson River Estuary Science Advisory Committee and is chair of that committee. The Hudson River Foundation is another major actor, but you've got so many 50, 60 organizations with Hudson in their name. So if we don't mention everybody tonight, it's not because we don't care. It's just because we could spend 50 minutes mentioning everybody's work and everybody who works on the Hudson. So what I really want to start with is just some very basic questions about the Hudson River and how you got there. So why don't we start with how you got there? 13,000 days of Cary research, many of which I'd say probably a third of those were your days monitoring the river's health. But what brought you to the Hudson River?
So my interest in the Hudson River and my capability to sort of make a career of studying the Hudson River came about in large part because at the time, the Institute of Ecosystem Studies, as it was called, founded by Gene Likens, was a brand new institute, and it had a brand new staff. And there were basically 5 of us that worked together closely to generate the basic knowledge about the Hudson. It was myself, Nina Caraco, John Cole, Dave Strayer, and Mike Pace, all with different expertises. And we were sort of brought together and presented with this wonderful research institution. And Gene's philosophy was, go figure out what you want to do and be good at it. And so the group looked around for a little bit, and fairly quickly it became obvious that there was a major river system 20 miles outside our doorstep. The river system, we can't say was unstudied, but it certainly wasn't completely studied. And, given geographic proximity and this sort of nucleus of expertise, diverse expertise, the group came together and began, measuring things we knew how to measure. We had expectations of how those things were going to change over time, which things might be increasing, which things might be decreasing, how they interacted with each other. And gradually over the years, and the slide on the screen refers to, the large number of years this went on, those descriptive findings turned into a variety of questions, both, what's driving the changes, what can we as people do to sort of manage those changes, perhaps push them in directions we like, and, good, solid observations, carefully conducted over a long period of time, lead to a great understanding of how the system works, and generates more questions as it goes, partly because you uncover new things and partly because the system is always changing. So we came together, this group of 5 at a new institution with the opportunity for a new focus. And it sort of developed from there into, what you're going to hear a little bit about this evening.
Well, thanks. And if people look at that iconic river slide, you'll see there are 2 things on it, really. There's the indication of the effort over what's now a 35-year endeavor. But also, I think one of the interesting things is, as you said, if you observe and you understand through observation, then you can ask better questions. And one of the overarching changes, of course, is the warming of the river through climate change, the rising of the river. And I think you said to me once that there's about 25-30% more water flowing down the river now than there was 35 years ago because of increased rainfall, albeit much of it coming all at once in catastrophic or major storms. Another thing that clearly has been changing, and this is why these long-term, multi-decadal investments are so important, is the appearance of some new invasive species. And while many exotic species arrive, very few of them become wildly invasive. But 2 in particular, zebra mussels and water chestnuts, have been at the core of different studies and different pieces of our study. And I was wondering if you could sort of say, what are the lessons we've learned about these invasions, because we had pre and post data, which again was very unusual for a lot of invasive species studies. Often they only start getting studied and the systems only start getting studied when they're invading.
Yeah, so one of the major changes that we fully expected to see was some new species show up, and that species would somehow change the rest of the system or do something differently that would cause changes in other parts of the system. The Hudson has a lot of invasive species. Something like 1/3 of the fishes don't really belong here, but have arrived one way or the other, and there are a multitude of ways. There are a lot of plants that don't belong in the valley, but they've gotten here one way or the other. And so anticipating new species is something that we ought to do. This is not to say we ought to take this lying down, and we'll return to that later, but it's something that we expect to occur to these ecosystems and may well have changes. The zebra mussels and water chestnut are probably 2 of the best known invasives, and I'll say just a couple of things about each one of these. The zebra mussels were an accidental introduction. It came in via ballast water through the Great Lakes, reached the Hudson in roughly 1992, so has been with us a long time. Before the zebra mussel arrived, the group, and this was a lot of the work of Dave Strayer, predicted that phytoplankton biomass would decline tremendously. And in fact, it did by roughly 80% and has stayed down to 20% of the levels that it occurred before the zebra mussel arrived. And so that was sort of expected. And there have been all sorts of ramifications of that. Obviously, the food web that eats these small plants has also suffered a great deal. And there are some species of zooplankton that have never recovered since arrival of the zebra mussels. And some other species have sort of learned to get by and have come back to some extent. The other thing about the zebra mussels, there are things we thought would happen that did not happen. And so we're always prepared for surprises. We should always be prepared for surprises. And we anticipated that the water would become clearer because these things filter voraciously. They filter the entire volume of the Hudson River every 2 to 3 days. The water of the Hudson passes through a zebra mussel. And given the size of the particles in the water that give it its sort of murky and turbid nature, we thought that would go away. The zebra mussels were going to clean it up. And this has happened in Lake Erie, for instance. Turns out that the turbidity or clarity of the water in the Hudson hasn't changed a bit since the zebra mussels arrived. And the reason is the particles that they take out, the tides resuspend and put right back in the water roughly every 6 hours. So we've got an invasive that's having an effect on turbidity, and the physical nature of the river is putting those particles right back in. So there's no net change. Water chestnut is possibly the invasive that people know the best and perhaps hate the most. This is a plant that was intentionally introduced. Well, we won't get into names, but it was someone that frankly should have known better. It's very visible, causes big physical changes in the environment of the Hudson. There's no light that reaches the bottom of the river underneath these plant beds, as are shown here. This is near Newburgh. And so the plants that used to live rooted to the bottom can't do it anymore. And so the water chestnut has displaced these native plants. The very largest beds cause a reduction in how much oxygen is present in the water. And that's generally considered a bad thing. We worked very hard through the Clean Water Act to get oxygen back in the water, and these plants cause the opposite effect. In all fairness, the plant is habitat for some fishes, and it does have positive benefits for removing some pollutants. So it's always a bit of a mixed bag. But again, this is an invasive that had big effects and is continuing to have big effects. And we're lucky from our studies that we know something about those effects.
And Stuart, before we move on to submerged aquatic vegetation more specifically, what was the reason that they put the water chestnut in? What were they hoping to, what problem were they hoping to solve before they created new ones?
It was brought in because it's kind of a pretty aquatic plant. It's got a lovely little white flower. For those of you that are out there and can take a moment to have a look, it's a very pretty little plant. It's not such a pretty big plant. And so this is where the problem comes. It's brought in intentionally because it looks nice.
Okay, so it was not trying to solve one ecological problem.
No.
And cause another.
No.
It was purely an aesthetic.
For appearances.
Okay, so as many of the terrestrial plants are,
yeah.
Right, but more unusual in an aquatic. So I mentioned SAV or submerged aquatic vegetation. You've got a community science program, and I'll put a parenthesis. Community science programs are what have until recently been called citizen science programs, but it's shifting to a more inclusive term of community that looks at this submerged aquatic vegetation. And that includes mapping its response to extreme weather events. And, it's really important and really sensitive habitat. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit both about the study and why SAV is so important.
Okay, certainly. So the submersed plants are one of the pieces of the Hudson that was most poorly understood. So it was known that these things existed. The most common is water celery. It's Vallisneria americana. Goes by a variety of common names, but we try to stick with one, water celery. And it's the most common aquatic plant out there. Turns out it's very hard to see. And so when we start talking about trying to figure out how much is there, how it might be changing, where it comes and goes, why it comes and goes, you need to start with maps of where the thing occurs. And so much of the mapping is done from aerial photography. That works most of the time, but we wanted to have sort of the aquatic equivalent of boots on the ground, and that's where these volunteers come into play. Over the years, there have been, well over 100 people who spend part of their summer going out to points that we provide them, and they do a whole series of observations from a protocol that's got a quality assurance plan and data checking and all that sort of thing. And so they cover essentially the whole river with their observations, all the way from Troy down past the Mario Cuomo Bridge. And we get about 200 points recorded every year. And they give us an annual estimate of sort of what's out there. The aerial photos get done about every 5 years, but not always every 5 years. And it takes a year to work up the data from those photos. So they're a little bit out of date by the time we get them. These volunteers report back in fall, and the data are immediately available and up for analysis. What you see in the graph here is going from 2010 up to last summer, the percent of points that they looked at that had plants present. And the way the survey is designed, I won't go into it. We expect about 40% of the plots to have plants present. And so that's about where we were before Tropical Storm Irene and Lee came through in late 2011. And I'll have a photo of what that looked like in just a second here. But after Irene, we lost about 90% of the coverage of these aquatic plants. They simply disappeared. And through some work, we figured out why. It turns out they were smothered by the sediment that was brought in by the storms. But the important part of the volunteer data is they show this year by year faltering, sometimes recovery. And now 8 years later, we're back to more or less where we started. So this is a natural recovery that occurred. There was no effort to replant these things, although if you look at 2013, 2014, there was a lot of push, why don't you do something? And we kept hoping, with actually less and less confidence as time went on, that natural recovery would solve the problem, and it did, but it took a while. And so we know from the observation of these volunteers just how long it takes. And so this habitat that got wiped out, we know it's important for fishes, we know it provides oxygen to the system, and we now know that it is resilient, but it takes a long time to get there. So we really need to be protecting this habitat so we don't have to go through 7, 8, 9 years of low abundance after an event or some other disturbance to the habitat.
Right. And I think that one of the things that's really important, and it comes through from everything you've said, again, is the value of long-term data, right? That if you had not been collecting and had not continued collecting these data, it would be hard to know that these natural cycles were happening. And those data come through many different avenues, one of which is the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System, which, of course, given the mouthful we call HRECOS, the H is silent. It took me a while to figure that out. I kept wanting to say HRECOS, but just HRECOS. And it's a network of real-time measurements. And, increasingly, as technology gets better, if we have more money, we could really keep improving these sensors. But how is it used, and how do you see it evolving in the future? Maybe a little bit about how it evolved in the past and what the challenges have been.
So this network of sensors covers a large part of the Hudson, all the way down to the city and all the way to Troy, as well as several sites in the Mohawk. So we've got there's a map there on the screen for you. So we've got quite good coverage of what's happening at these locations. These sites report about 8 to 10 variables every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, except when something goes wrong, which does happen, but not terribly often. So we get a continuous stream of practically real-time observations on temperature, salt content, how clear the water is, how much oxygen is in it, the acidity, whole variety of really important things. And it's sort of like being able to take your pulse constantly. And so these data have largely been used for research purposes. They really do tell you something about the state of the system. So for instance, in the Hudson, there used to be big problems with low oxygen events. Large stretches of the river were simply devoid of oxygen. And now this extensive network of high frequency observation shows us that's almost never a problem anymore. And again, this is thanks to the Clean Water Act and dealing with wastewater. So it gives us a good sense of what's going well with the river or the occasional problems. One of the problems that it was designed to address is unusual events that would be hard to sample sort of the traditional way. So before we had sensors that would go out and collect information for us, we always used what I call the butts in boats approach, where you had to get people in a boat with a bottle to go out and collect a water sample, bring it back, measure something. And that's fine, and that's still very useful and is still done frequently. But it would be hard to get a bunch of volunteers or paid staff, for that matter, to go out after Irene in the conditions you see on the right-hand side there and really capture what was going on. And so there's a whole story about the consequences of Irene for a number of aspects of the Hudson. But without this network of sensors, we would not have been able to sort of watch those consequences develop, figure out how long they last, which things behaved the way we expected, which things did not. And so Irene is relatively soon after the whole network was put into place, and it really showed us the value. We were pretty sure about the value, but it really showed us the value of that. Looking to the future, we know there are other problems looming for the Hudson. And one of these that we're fortunate we don't face a lot yet are algal blooms. And the image at the bottom shows a high density of probably a blue-green alga or blue-green bacterium. And these things are certainly annoying and at times toxic and lethal. There have been reports in the Hudson these things do occur. They're fairly sporadic, don't last very long, but one of the climate change consequences is as things get warmer, these things will likely, almost certainly, become more common. So one of the things we want to do now is field test the sensors that have been designed for detecting these harmful algae and make sure they work in the Hudson and would be useful as generating sort of early warnings for what's happening in the Hudson. These sensors have been around for a while, but they need to be sort of calibrated and validated in local conditions. So the network has been very useful for research describing the system. It's widely used for education, particularly this past year when students obviously can't get out and do any sort of data collection themselves. These streams of data that are available have been used for a lot of different things. Kerry Institute, as you know, runs this data jam where students use the available data to sort of tell a story about the Hudson. So the HRECOS network has done a number of different things and will continue into the future with some improvements, I think.
Right. And I always make a pitch for funding at the end of this if people want to support us, but I want to make a pitch for funding, not us, but HRECOS. There is one sensor network in particular that's very important that is on the walkway over the Hudson that has been out for, what, a year?
I'd say not quite a year.
Not quite a year. If anybody wants to sponsor that, it's like $4,000 plus or minus round figures. Let us know. We'd be happy to buy a sensor and help get it put in. That will be my only pitch right now. I think these data is what's really hard for people to get is the way in which science really does inform management, right? And you've talked about all the different kinds of data we collect, the way we've been able to understand changes in things like oxygen. Many people know the monitoring of the PCBs and the dredging and the impact that's had on the Hudson fisheries. The fact that I think the Hudson is one of the few natural rivers that has not lost a species since we started counting them of fish. But there are lots of things going on in the Hudson. And, how do we take the data and ensure that this wonderful data set is deployed to help manage the river better? You mentioned a few examples, but can we sort of step back maybe to 10,000 feet and talk about the processes by which data feed into management and policy?
Yeah, certainly. And this is, again, been a hallmark of the Kerry Institute since its beginning. And my term for this, transmission of data and scientific understanding into some sort of action, something management can do to improve a situation. This is what I call effective science. So you have to have good science, right? But it can also be effective, and then it causes something positive to happen. And the Institute, since its beginning, has always encouraged us to talk to people about what we found out. If there's a chance someone can benefit and do their job better because of something we found out, make sure they know about it. So this has been a hallmark of the Institute since its beginning. We are very lucky, the Institute, and frankly, the Valley is very lucky in that we have very strong connections to management organizations. And I'm going to mention three. At the risk of annoying the ones that don't get mentioned. There's the Hudson River Estuary Program that Fran Dunwell leads. And then there's the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve that currently Heather Gearloff is managing, and Betsy Blair for many years before that. Both of these are connected to DEC. DEC is the state agency, Department of Environmental Conservation, is the state agency responsible for the natural resources of New York State, and is supposed to look after them for all of us. I think they do a fine job of that. And the Estuary Program and the Research Reserve are our conduits for getting information from sort of, out of the notebooks and into some sort of actionable capacity. And I'll talk about one example in just a second. The third thing we're lucky to have is the Hudson River Foundation. And they are not tied to any regulatory agency, but they've done a great job sort of watching the horizon. What's coming up? What might we need to be worried about 5 years from now? And they hold workshops and they try and figure out what are these potential issues? What's the science? What do we need to learn to get ready and be ready to take some action? So those three are really lucky in helping us take science and make it effective. I want to talk about the shoreline work for a minute because it's a good example of this. The Kerry Institute, with funding from NOAA and HRF, for some years looked at the shorelines of the Hudson. And the shorelines of the Hudson are very diverse. They're all different kinds. Some are serving a very particular purpose. Some used to serve a very particular purpose that they're not serving anymore. And so we did the work of trying to determine how much of these different kinds of shorelines is there, how are they functioning ecologically, can we have shorelines that do the job that needs to be done when there's a job to be done, but aren't so ecologically damaging. And so we have two examples here. On the right-hand side is what's fairly typical for what would be used as a sort of working shoreline. It's this vertical steel bulkhead, usually has deep water right next to it, usually for some sort of docking purposes. From a fish's point of view, or a bird's point of view, or small animals' point of view, this is a tough place to live. There are strong currents, big waves, no cover, no place to sort of tuck in and take a little break from the tribulations of the world. On the left-hand side is a shoreline that is serving a protective purpose. There's a parking lot just further off to the left that was getting eroded. And this shoreline is also supposed to protect that piece of property. They don't want to lose their parking lot. It's a state It's a town piece of property. But in this case, the design of the shoreline was such that you had, rows of stone that were capable of breaking waves and keeping the ice off the parking lot. But interspersed, you had vegetation and different sizes of stones and sort of gaps in the stones for things that needed to move across the shore zone. So there's a much more diverse set of habitats and opportunities for a variety of organisms to make their way or make their living on this kind of shoreline relative to the one on the right. So that's the science understanding of it. In order to get these things built, we need to get in touch with the managers because the managers are the ones that write permits about what's allowed to be done on a shoreline. We need to get in touch with the engineers because they're the one that do the drawings for what's going to be done on a particular piece of property. We need to get hold of the landscape architects because, again, they do designing about what's going on here. And we need to get hold of property owners to say, we have a sort of kindler and gentler way for you to meet your needs, but still have some ecological benefits. So it's that, generation of the information and transmitting it to the people that are making decisions on the ground about this kind of habitat, this kind of land use in particular, that I think is a good example of what I call effective science.
And that's why we like to say we do science for environmental solutions. And I think, Stuart, that's really important because people tend to bifurcate science into theory and good science and applied science. And I think the way you've spoken about it makes it clear that good science is needed for management and that it can be very applied, but nonetheless very important from a theoretical and knowledge generation perspective, right? So it's not one or the other. So you've been studying the Hudson for 30 plus years. You know an awful lot about it. You and Dave Strayer, John Cole, Nina Caraco, it's really a remarkable group of people. We've got some new people coming up, but I'm sort of wondering from your perspective, what do you see as the challenges, for the next, 30 years plus or minus, could be longer. I'm not saying you have to continue to help remediate those challenges for the next 30 years, but if you were writing, if Dr. Findlay were writing a prescription to do work on the Hudson, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing us?
Okay, so I'm just going to mention a couple, and the first is broad, it's climate change, and then I will speak about just two pieces of that. So climate is changing everything. Climate is changing around us. It's happening. I think there's really no debate about that anymore. So what does it mean for the Hudson? And it means lots of things. I'm just going to talk about two examples, and maybe some of the questions will focus on this. First is the rising sea level are going to affect whether wetlands are capable of persisting. And if they are capable of persisting, will they retain their same characteristics that they have now? So the image on the left shows you a picture taken from Tivoli Bays, part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve. And you see the zonation there. There's a group of plants in the foreground, and these plants are used to being underwater essentially every high tide. And that's the way they've evolved, and it's fine with them. The plants in the background are used to having sort of their lower half wet, probably, several days a month, maybe 1 week per month, depending upon the tidal range. And so they don't want to be submerged. As sea levels are rising, if sea levels rise fast enough, we may lose the whole thing. None of these plants can be completely submerged by 6 feet of water permanently. So if we really get to that rate and state of sea level rise, we may well lose the whole thing. But in the interim, what we're pretty sure is going to happen is we're going to convert wetlands from having this mixture of vegetation with the sort of short form in the front and the tall form in the back, and we'll only have the short form. And that's a loss of diversity. And we happen to know that those tall plants in the background, and a lot of them are cattails, native cattails. We know they serve particular purposes and are very valuable from an ecological point of view, and also valuable from a human point of view, in that they help, slow down waves and can act as a bit of a storm barrier. So there's a chance as sea levels rise that we're going to lose that community from the Hudson River wetlands. Whether this comes to pass, what are we going to do about it? These are very interesting questions that people are set up to study now. And there are some fairly significant management actions that might need to be taken, and people are getting ready to either do those or think seriously about them. But this is a big deal, and we sort of know it's coming, and I think we're prepared to address it. Whether we succeed in keeping these wetlands remains to be seen. The other aspect of climate change is obviously it's getting warmer, and I already mentioned that when it gets warmer, it's beneficial to these blue-green bacteria that are harmful in many ways, not just unpleasant to look at, but harmful in many ways. And there are several aspects of the Hudson, not just warmer, but possibly the water column will not mix as readily as it does now. And both those would lead to greater likelihood of these harmful algal blooms. So we are afraid this is going to become more common. And again, we're trying to be better prepared for sort of early detection of these. So that's the first challenges. The second challenges return to one of the past challenges, and that's invasives. Invasives are part of the Hudson. There are a lot of them here now. We have to pick our battles about what to do about the ones that are already present. But by far and away, the cheapest and most effective thing we can do is keep out the next set of invasive species. The ones we're really worried about now are these invasive Asian carp. And these are famously known as the jumping carp. And there are probably about 1,000 videos on YouTube or Instagram or whatever showing these jumping carp and how obnoxious they are. They're also extremely damaging ecologically and have caused major changes in the waterways through the Mississippi drainage, which is where they are these days. And as much as we don't want them in the Mississippi drainage, we certainly don't want them in the Hudson drainage. And right now, they have a wide open back door into the Hudson River, and that's the Erie Canal. Some of you in the audience probably know there's a big effort led by New York government to reimagine the Erie Canal. It's probably not sensible to think about the Erie Canal as sort of this commercial transport corridor that it was created to be over 100 years ago. It can have many tremendous benefits. It has currently a lot of economic value to people along the canal and visitors and tourists. But if we're going to rethink how we use this resource, we also need to think about doing something about closing that back door, taking some action so that these invasives don't come down and cause what are certain to be big negative effects. So there are more challenges than that. I'll just leave it at that in the interest of time.
All right. There are many different things we could talk about. I mean, I think I just want to note that with the Erie Canal, all you need to do is fill in a very small piece of it to prevent the flow from happening. If people get live carp, we ask that you do not release your pets when they get too big, because that's another avenue into the Hudson River. So what do you think? Obviously science has a real role to play. The study of how these invasives come in and the damage they can wreak on an ecosystem clearly makes a strong argument for looking at this. Climate change impacts, I think, are both micro and macro. But what do you think the sort of the future of science, or the science in the future of the Hudson River is, as the slide that's up there says, is, and how can we better use science to help inform the management of the river?
Yeah, so for those of you in the audience, and I did look at the attendee list, so there are at least a few people that know me. I'm a glass half full person. And so I'm quite optimistic about the future of science contributing to the betterment of the Hudson River and many other resources around the country as well. And I'm going to mention 3 reasons for that optimism. The first is we have shown that we can conduct, we is a very big we at this point. It's not me and it's not the people at the Cary, but a very big we. We have shown that we can make difficult decisions, put management into place, and have it pay off the way we want. And the example from the Hudson that I'm going to use is sturgeon management. Probably some of you know that at one point, sturgeon were an extremely important commercial fishery in the Hudson. At one point, when the railroads were being built, it was called Albany beef, and it was a cheap source of food for all the people building the railroads. It was horribly overfished. And there was a decision made by DEC, and at the time I was on the advisory committee, there was a decision made by DEC to close the fishery, cut off the fishery, no more commercial fishing, no more, you're no longer allowed to possess dead sturgeon. Hugely controversial. It was an iconic historical fishery, huge pushback. DEC said, the science shows us we need to do this. They did it. And I think the data show, the State of the Hudson was released recently by DEC. The data show that the sturgeon are making a comeback. Hard decision to make, a lot of people unhappy, did have the desired effect. So we should recognize those successes when they occur. The second thing I'll say is that we have a really, the slide says vital Hudson River community. I like to talk about the Hudson as a river with a constituency. And so many, many people that live in the valley care a great deal about the Hudson. Sometimes they care about the same things I do, sometimes they care about something different, but they care about the system. And that's really valuable because they speak up. And so we're fortunate in that a lot of the folks from the public, you know, say something, take care of our river, look after our river. We want to use our river. And we're very fortunate, as I mentioned before, that we have the Hudson River Foundation that, again, looks out at that horizon and says, how are we going to address, you know, future issues? What are the problems that might be coming up? How are we going to develop the science that makes those happen? There's a photo here of Ned. Ned was instrumental both in getting Cary started and getting the foundation started, and he continues to play a strong role today. We owe him a debt of gratitude. Dennis was a science director of the Hudson River Foundation for over 20 years. We lost him too soon. He was a great friend. I have to stop from crying at this point because it's a really difficult thing. Great friend, great leader, great mentor, brought us forward on many tough decisions. And, you know, he's gone too soon, but he left a legacy of, you know, doing good work to bring people together to worry about the river. And the third reason I'm optimistic is look at the students. I mean, the next generation that frankly is going to bear the burden of climate change, they're also tremendously engaged and tremendously bright and interested in learning and putting into action the science they're capable of doing. And so for the students that want to go forward with some sort of, you know, research career or science career or just bumping up their science credentials, there are a lot of ways to do that. Many run through the Kerry Institute, some supported by the Hudson River Foundation, the Estuary program. There's a consortium of colleges and universities. There are lots of opportunities. So students that want to do this and find out whether or not it's for them, there are lots of ways to sort of, I'll say, test the waters, if you'll excuse me, a bad pun. So for those reasons, I don't see why we can't keep doing good science and bringing it to the people that can use it and having it put into action for desirable things to come about. And again, if you look at that third panel, it's the next generation that's going to carry the load on this.
Well, and I think it's fair to say, Stuart, that, you know, when I was growing up in New York City, there were days you couldn't breathe the air and you certainly didn't want to go swimming in the Hudson. There were so many threats. And, you know, I think you've mentioned the Clean Water Act at least 3 times by my count, maybe 4. Gene's work on acid rain and the Clean Air Act. I think we need to recognize that science is necessary, but not sufficient. It can inform good policy, but regulation is really a critical part of this, and science allows us to measure the impact of the regulation. So that's really important as well. You know, you've mentioned the students, you've mentioned the various things people can do, from volunteering to studying submerged aquatic vegetation and having an excuse that, to go out in a kayak, not that one needs one, to being a student and studying the Hudson River. What are some other things that people who've called in today or logged in today can do to help take action?
So there are lots, and I'll start with sort of be a good watershed steward, because everyone lives in a watershed. I would like to think that everyone listening today knows what watershed they live in, and if you don't, you can come up with that fairly easily. But you live in a place where everything you do is sort of gathered up by the water that flows past you and carried on to some other place. Maybe that water is better after you touched it, and maybe it's not. But if you are a good watershed steward, there's a chance the water will be better. So simple things like, taking care of your land, not allowing erosion, looking after your septic system. There are lots and lots of things that you can do to make sure that the water that passes by you is no worse for the contact. Secondly, support science. And this, in one way you say support science, people think you say, oh, send money to someone. And I'll nominate the Kerry Institute at this point, but it's not strict just support science with your dollars, but support science by recognizing what it can bring to your life, to what you see in the world around you. I encourage you to be curious about what you see around you. And if there's something weird that doesn't look right, or you've never seen before, ask somebody. Someone would be happy to help you. I am pretty sure this is Dr. Strayer instructing someone on something that I can't discern. But Dave was great at this, is great at this. He's always happy to point out some natural history, curiosity, and people say, oh, wow, I didn't know that was going on around me. So be curious yourself, and encourage the students. Being a student is tough this past year in particular. It's a hard job, and it takes dedication, and it takes thinking broadly, and it takes, being careful with your studies and planning your studies and thinking about what you're going to do. So they've got a lot to learn. They have a lot to do with that learning, and so support them any way you can. And then lastly, I think this comes up all the time, and it relates back to the idea of the Hudson having a constituency. Say something. If you care about what's going on, say something about it. If you like what you see, congratulate someone that you think has helped bring that about. If you don't like what you see, figure out who's supposed to be looking after it, and complain to them about it. You won't hurt their feelings. You may be helping them do their job, but yeah, say something about it. And on that note, I just have to say, given the timing, the right now out for public comment is the action agenda that provides the guidance to the estuary program in everything from fisheries to education to land conservation to water quality, all sorts of things. And it's out for public comment. You can say what you like, you can say what you don't like about it, but it's out there for you to speak up on, and it's available through, I'm sure Lori can dig up the website and stick it in the chat for future reference, but it's out for public comment for a while. So speak up, and then participate locally. We all live somewhere, and many of the decisions are made locally. It's your local town, the village, to less extent the county. But your local municipality has a lot to say about what happens around you to the natural resources. And so again, if you like the way they're doing it, tell them. It'll encourage them. If you don't like the way they're doing it, tell them, and it will probably discourage them, and maybe they'll do something differently. But if you don't speak up, it's a little tough to complain. So those are things anyone can do for the Hudson, as well as our natural resources in general.
Thanks, Stuart. And I really appreciate your starting with the comment that if you like something that's getting done, congratulate people and thank them, because I think politicians are, they're human beings, and they like to know that they're doing things right. We've got a whole bunch of questions. You did mention the chat, and I do want to say Lori Quillen, our assiduous director of communications, has been putting some resources in the chat. The Q&A is where questions go. And I want to start with one question, which gets back to the oxygen. You mentioned that over the years, oxygen levels have improved, but in some, Clarence Henry asked, in some towns and cities, when you have a massive storm event, you get raw sewage flowing into the Hudson. Why doesn't that have a bigger impact? And why is it that things are better despite that?
So clearly having raw wastewater going to the Hudson is a bad thing. I don't want anyone to be dissuaded somehow that I think this is good for the system, because it's not. One of the things, I'll say two things. Many places up and down the Hudson have controlled their combined sewer overflows. New York City has done a great job of that. They're not done, but they've done a great job of that. And so it still happens much less often, but much less often than it used to. Albany is still in the works. They have quite a long way to go, and they know it. I'm not telling stories here. They know it. They have a plan in place. They're working on the infrastructure, and I have every confidence that it will, come to pass. It takes a long time. Infrastructure, as anyone that reads a newspaper right now, is something everybody loves until you have to pay for it, and then they don't love it quite so much. So the other thing about wastewater, the only good thing about CSOs is they happen when there's high flow events. And right. So you get dilution and you get the water moving out of the system fairly quickly. If you took, a stretch of the river in August when there's not much fresh new water coming into the system and dump the same amount of waste into it, you'd have much bigger problems than having, the waste along with a big sort of flushing event. Not trying to make a pun again.
That's great, thanks. We have a couple tributary questions. Tributaries are on my mind because I greatly enjoyed the Hudson River Watershed Alliance event on Tuesday night, the Toast to the Tribs. But the tributaries, two questions. One is, what would be the impact of undamming tributaries, in the Hudson, Wappingers, Fishkill, et cetera? That comes from Fred Whitridge. And so could you talk a little bit about, what undamming would do and why we're not doing more of it?
So I'll start with the last part. The reason we're not doing more of it is it's expensive, and the individual owner has to pay much of that money, not necessarily all of it. So that's why more is not being done. The science of how to do it and the engineering of how to do it is not that hard. It's not cookbook, but it's not that hard. It's money. The consequences of undamming large stretches of the tributary would be almost completely beneficial. You would allow migratory fishes to go up the tributaries. Most of the tributaries now have an artificial barrier relatively close to the Hudson. Some have a natural barrier, but most of them have an artificial barrier relatively close to the Hudson. So that for fishes, eels in particular, that want to go up the tributaries to reproduce, or in the case of eels, it's their young that want to live there for a little while, they can't get there. And so they get sort of hemmed in, so to speak. And so the big benefit would be opening up new habitat for these fishes to move. One of the big issues and concerns with dams is the nature of the sediments, the amount of sediment that might be held up behind the dam, as well as the potentially toxic nature of those sediments. Recent research projects showed that the amount of sediment held behind most of the dams in the Hudson Valley is really pretty small. And yeah, there would be places you need to worry about toxicity. Legacy contaminants are still a big issue, but most of the dams aren't holding that much sediment, and the release of sediment would probably not be a reason to not take out a dam.
Right. And the big dam, the Fort Edwards Dam, was the reason that we have all the PCBs in the Hudson, but you don't think the tributaries have the same pollutant problems?
Some certainly would.
Right.
There's no question some would, but it's not as widespread as people fear.
All right. So another question was, we talked about climate change, the rise in temperature, water flows increasing. How does the Hudson compare to other rivers? Because the Hudson is so tidal, and that makes it somewhat different. Are other rivers more heavily affected by climate change because they don't have the same tidal flows, or is it just depends on where you are and whether climate change is making your area drier or wetter or those kinds of things?
Right. So that's a big question, and probably most rivers will have some aspects that would respond differently to climate change. But the warming is going to drive species out. The tomcod has probably already been driven out. It was at its southern limit before, and as the river has warmed, it simply can't tolerate living here anymore. The thing about the Hudson is it's tidal for such a long portion. You know, it's 120 miles or something like that. And the Connecticut and Delaware and Potomac are nowhere near. They don't have anywhere near that sort of length of tidal influence. And it's just sort of an accident of geology, which is completely separate.
Very narrow.
But, yeah. But the Hudson has, because of this long length of tidal influence, it's got a lot of these tidal wetlands. And so we sort of have more to lose. Not that the Delaware and Connecticut want to lose their tidal wetlands, but we have more to gain by having these wetlands and more to lose by having them potentially go away as sea levels rise.
So at some level, because of the tidal flows, the Hudson may be more resilient, but perhaps not resilient enough.
Yeah, quite possibly not resilient enough.
Right. While Dan asks about, you know, the risks to the Hudson as a source of drinking water, which it is for many people, and how that relates to harmful algal blooms, I assume they are closely related.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a harmful algal bloom near a drinking water intake, it is essentially impossible to remove the toxins at that scale. If you have small volumes, a charcoal filter will take them out, but at the scale of you know, a municipality's drinking water intake, there's not much that can be done about, you know, a contaminated you know, water supply at the point of intake.
So then it would rely on a rainfall or something to wash out the bloom, and so it could be days or weeks of having to find alternative water sources for
it would be a very unfortunate situation.
Yeah, that's the scientist's way of saying it would be really bad.
It'd be really bad. Toledo was shut down from its water source for 2 or 3 weeks or something when Erie had a bloom, for example.
Yeah,
I don't think they're very happy about it.
Yeah. So we mentioned sturgeon and their recovery and the fact that not fishing them. We haven't been fishing shad for quite a while. There aren't Atlantic salmon haven't, I'm not sure they were ever in the Hudson, but if they were, they haven't recovered yet. What's preventing other fish from recovering?
So there were not salmon in the Hudson, as best we can tell. I'm sure someone dumped a couple in at some point, but there were not naturally salmon in the Hudson. Shad are one of these very difficult multi-component problems. There were issues about fishing in the Hudson and possibly taking too many shad out of the Hudson, which you know, DEC could address. It's a state, you know, it's the state mandate to manage their fishery. It appears, and I'm not going to sound 100% confident on this because I'm not sure it's 100% nailed down. It appears that the catch of shad in the coastal waters, the shad go out of the river, mix in this big sort of metapopulation off the coast all the way from Maine to the Carolinas. And the mortality that occurs out there, either targeted or sort of accidental in what is called bycatch, that appears to be a significant source of mortality. And that's under the control of a multi-state commission. It's not under the control of New York per se. So my guess is you could, you know, completely stop, you know, killing shad in the river, and it would still be in trouble because of the coastal mortality. I have to mention one other fisheries thing that's also going on right now. Indian Point just closed the last reactor, and they were, you know, removing huge quantities of water, clearly killing a lot of young fishes in the process. You know, are we going to see a tremendous rebound in fisheries now that that has gone by? The monitoring program for those fishes is in danger of being stopped right now. And it would be, if people want an issue that they want to bring to their political leaders, this would be a good one. It's like, we're going to give you something that's going to cure your disease, but we're going to stop measuring your blood pressure as soon as we give you the cure. Tell me that makes sense.
Right, and again, it's a great plug for long-term monitoring. I'm going to end with a question that you know, is, I think, on many people's minds. Wetlands migrate, right? And one of the issues about human retreat from the coast is to allow wetlands the ability, coastal wetlands, the ability to migrate inland and not be blocked by roads or people or railways. What's stopping the Hudson wetlands from having the same response to rising water?
They can. It's almost certain that they can. The issue with the Hudson wetlands is that many of the ones are blocked. Many of the wetlands are blocked either by some structure that we've put there, like the railroad, which is unlikely to move significantly in the near term, or the actual topography. For folks that have taken the train and gone through the highlands, asking the wetlands to climb up those mountains to escape rising sea levels is not going to happen. So there are both natural impediments to large scale migration of the wetlands, as well as things we've built that blocks their sort of escape route, so to speak.
Well, several people have asked about why we are not mentioning river keepers, scenic Hudson, Clearwater. I could keep going. As I said, there are over 50 organizations that care about the Hudson. We are blessed with a remarkable diversity of people and institutions that care about the Hudson, care about the tributaries, care about the fisheries, care about education. And I'll say that for those I didn't mention, please don't take it the wrong way. It is a remarkable group of people doing remarkable work in support of the Hudson and in support of the state, who has the responsibility for its management. And the Hudson River Estuary Program really is a remarkable organization who has done a really great job of helping to recover the river. And we are greatly appreciative of being their partners. And speaking of partners, I would like to thank Harney Tees. The Harney family has been remarkably generous and has supported our public lectures both in real life and in virtual life. We hope that we'll all be back in real life events soon enough. But I think we've also learned that we can get a lot of people coming to our events from all over the country and in some cases all over the world. As the slide says, you can't make a better world without knowing how it works. One of my joys as president of Kerry Institute is to know that our science contributes to understanding how the world works and helping to make the world a better place. If you'd like to support us, please go to the website or support any one of the number of organizations I've mentioned and haven't mentioned who do great work on the Hudson. Stuart, I'd like to thank you for a really wonderful chat. We'll do this again, maybe not too soon, but I look forward to bringing you back in a year or two and getting an update. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. I'm looking out my window. It's still light out and it doesn't appear to be raining. So hope you can have either dinner or a late drink or just sit and watch the bats and the swifts come out. Thanks very much and come again soon.